Never got much traction last year, but there was a fairly feeble attempt at getting people all worked up about the Mayan calendar foretelling the end of the world early in December of 2012. Somehow people just couldn't seem to get all that exercised about a civilization predicting our demise 500 years after they weren't able to forestall their own demise. So they just didn't seem to have the credibility necessary to get people all excited. You know, it wasn't like it was a Y2K thing. Mayans are not much interesting to me as prophets of the distant future, but I have found historical musings about what brought their civilization to an end very interesting. The current speculation is that they had a theocratic government in which the priests were the educated class who kept records about agricultural sciences, and they just told everybody else what to do. They informed the public of when and how to plant, what crops, and when to harvest. At some point, there appears to have been a peasant uprising in which the laborers killed off the priestly class, but with them went their ability to organize and to manage their agricultural life. The Mayans didn't entirely cease to exist, but their civilization broke down and their numbers dramatically decreased as survivors returned to a much more primitive hunter-gatherer society. Ancient religions are all mixed up in agricultural cycles and in practical wisdom. In fact, Islam is arguably the first of the world religions that is not tied to an agricultural season. And so their holidays move around in the year. You can have your fast that actually falls in the summer or in the winter, depending upon how their calendar works out for that year. But it's not predicated on an annual or an agricultural calendar. Most of our Old Testament is full of what was, at the time of its being written, wisdom teachings about agriculture, economics, government, and family life. As such, Scripture was a source not so much of mythology, but of helpful information. Jewish dietary code wasn't just to keep the Jews separate from other people. It was also generally good health advice for what to eat and what not to eat at the time. In our lifetimes, there's been a lot of conversation about the conflict between science and religion. And though there have certainly been some high-profile and laughable historical examples of this conflict, it wasn't until the modern era that the two universes of knowledge appeared to draw a line in the sand and start fighting each other. Michael Dowd, the author of Thank God for Evolution, has argued that the new scripture for our generation should be scientific evidence. He says that we need to give up our obsession with ancient texts to focus on what can rationally be known through empirical sciences. And by the way, Michael and his wife are planning to come and live in the annex next spring, April through July, so that the two of us can work on a joint writing project of a new lectionary that will offer an alternative to churches, to spend 1 year at least reading modern fact-based literature as the predicate of a worship service. I hope that we can agree on 52 selections and get that into print. As you see in this reading from Proverbs this morning, the ancient Jews revered wisdom, but in our age, it seems oftentimes religion actually reveres ignorance. This is one of the most crucial aspects of progressive Christianity. This is really what made me willing to come back to parish life after having given up on church entirely a few years ago, because we were willing to start a church that rejected all forms of magic and superstition in favor of a fact-based, reality-oriented spirituality. We are unwilling to make grand truths about things that cannot be known. There are undoubtedly a lot of things that are true that we don't know, but just because a religious claim cannot be shown to be either true or false doesn't mean that we have to act like we believe in the wild assertions that people make about things that have never been seen, that cannot be seen, cannot be known. We don't talk about heaven and hell and angels and demons and souls and spirits and incarnation or the Trinity or even a really good haggis. No one's ever seen a really good haggis. They talk about haggis. There really isn't any. Many in our era have abandoned the church and given up on religion because it seems to confuse facts with imaginary beliefs. But I'm telling you that I've come back to church, come back to religion, because in my observations, our culture is combining facts with imaginary beliefs. The major Western religions were all, in one way or another, something akin to the Mayan revolt against their ruling class. Judaism began among escaped slaves from Egypt. Zoroastrianism was a challenge to the inequality between peasants and the ruling class of Persians. Christianity took root among an occupied and oppressed peoples who were being impoverished by a ruthless empire. Even Islam began as a reform movement that sought to elevate the poor, the oppressed, and ironically, even challenged the traditional Jewish and Christian discrimination against women. The future of the church must be to once again fall in love with wisdom. We must be the protectors and the proponents of what is true and not what is imaginary. I don't want to sound paranoid to you, but I have to tell you, while people have a very good reason to look askance at the reliability of religion as a source of true information, you should not rationally assume that either your government or corporations or the media are all that devoted to truth, especially if we within the church are not willing to speak truth to power. Allow me to illustrate. BP's putting a lot of ads on TV these days telling you the Gulf Coast has never been better. Y'all come on down. Everything's just wonderful. Because they've invested so much money in a cleanup of the oil spill of 2 years ago. But the chemical dispersant that they use to clean up oil, let me tell you about the cleanup with chemical dispersant. It neither disperses nor cleans up. All it does is it makes the oil form little balls that sink. And the chemical used to turn that oil into little balls that sink is more dangerous than the oil itself. So we are simply getting it out of our sight. We're not dispersing it and we're not cleaning it up. We're just feeding it to the bed of the ocean where marine life is being poisoned by it. Further, over 40 years ago, it was Republican President Richard Nixon who set up the EPA. Did you know that? The Environmental Protection Agency came from Richard Nixon after a major oil spill off the coast of California. But since this agency has been set up to protect our environment from pollution, Congress has passed legislation to exclude 70,000 different chemicals from regulation. 70,000 that they are not allowed to regulate. Folks, do you hear what I'm saying? 70,000 is 10,000 more than 60,000. You understand? A huge percentage of the chemicals that cause cancer, that kill people, that we should be worried about, the EPA, which is the agency set up to protect us from those things, is not legally allowed to consider those chemicals. Not because they were not dangerous, but because some lobbyists got an exclusion for a chemical that their company made a profit off of. We set up the Center for Disease Control at the end of World War II, largely to investigate how to stem the spread of malaria. Malaria was terrible during that time when we had sent people all over the world and in the South Pacific, my father being one of them. My father was hospitalized more than 20 times with attacks of malaria. So we set up an anti-malaria agency that became the Center for Disease Control to investigate how Americans were being killed either by communicable diseases or through accidents. They were the first ones to look at things we manufacture that can then hurt us. The gun lobby has gotten legislation passed that makes it illegal to investigate injuries from guns. Illegal. The second largest cause of death in the American population from accidents is from guns, and we are not even allowed to keep records. So that when congressmen will stand up and say, well, there's no evidence to prove that gun legislation reduces gun violence. The reason there's no evidence is they've made it illegal to keep evidence. We have to not count the numbers. Teddy Roosevelt set up the Food and Drug Agency to protect the public from foods and medications that had been, in his words, adulterated. The FDA is to protect us from food that has been adulterated. But now our current president appointed a vice president of the world's leading food adulterator, Monsanto, to be the advisor to the FDA. Many nations are now banning all genetically modified organisms from their food supply. Others make food labeling mandatory. Men and women, China mandates labeling GMOs in their food products, and China adds lead to the paint on children's toys and uses antifreeze to sweeten toothpaste. But even they want to know if there's GMOs in their food. But we have made it illegal to label foods as GMO-free. This is from the agency that spent 2 decades trying to figure out if tobacco is actually harmful. You really can't make this stuff up. It's not always just covering up truthful information. Sometimes it's intentional misinformation. You know, if we ever feel badly about education in Missouri, we really don't have to look too far. Kansas legislature is now considering a bill that would mandate that teachers misinform students regarding global climate change. They are actually considering legislation, and it is likely to pass, that will require teachers to tell their students not to believe in climate science. Though some of the crazy thinking in government is still traceable to the remaining vestiges of religious views that should have been set aside since the Enlightenment didn't show up everywhere in the world simultaneously. Recent polls indicate that 76% of Republicans believe that Jesus will return and bring the final judgment, which accounts for their indifference to pollution and climate change. We've literally had a congressman in Oklahoma saying that the world will end only when God ends it, that we human beings are not capable of damaging the creation. Illinois Congressman John Shimkus, who's the chair of the Committee on the Environment and the Economy, said that the end of the world comes when God declares it. Now, this is a guy who could not pass a 6th grade earth science test, who is in charge of America's subcommittee on the environment. Now, I don't want to say that his religion is ridiculous, but I will say that I wish that he could be reassigned to the Committee on Leprechauns and Wood Fairies. This past month, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reached 400 parts per million, which is a level that our planet has not seen for over 3 million years, back when the Earth was still cooling down and there was just lots of volcanic activity. But have any of you here heard that in the past month we reached the tipping point of carbon monoxide in the atmosphere? Have you heard that from any news source? One of the most significant things that has happened in our lifetime, not mentioned in corporate media. Because the truth would harm business, and in our civilization, profit is the real religion, and no one can question that profit without being labeled a heretic. The ancient Hebrews portrayed wisdom as a woman who stood in the marketplace, calling out to those who would listen to turn away from foolishness and to embrace the gift of wisdom, of truth, of understanding. Just accurate information. That is the call that we have to answer. We can no longer be held hostage to ancient superstitions that make us deny reality. Our greatest sacrament is the truth, and facts are our scripture. We will teach our children to think critically with real analytical skills, and we will not bow before a majority, no matter how large they are, that insist that we pretend to believe either what cannot be known or what is clearly false. I'm convinced that if you can get people to pretend to believe enough preposterous things, that you can get them to do preposterous things, like invade a country for no good reason, or poison your own land, water, and air, or even eat some kind of toxic frankenfood. But if you can eschew lies and magic and superstition, well, then let it be clearly said that one person armed with the truth constitutes a majority. We may not have access to all the information. We don't have all the truth about everything, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is still king. And it is our goal in this church to open both of our eyes. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.